Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Richfield 1111. I appreciate you tuning in and just allowing me to share my heart with you about grieving, about loss, about an emptiness. And I'm going to use that word a lot today because when I went through grieving, or when I've gone through grieving, even for my puppy that I had to put down, or even my mom or someone close to me passing away, there was an emptiness. And that's the way I describe it. That's the way I felt. So just to recap where we was last week, what I talked about on 11:11 last week, we talked about the stages of mourning and grief are universal. We know that. And that we actually understand that, and we know that for sure. And then grief is something that is experienced in many different ways. Matter of fact, it is experienced through terminal illness, a loss of a relationship, a death of a human being or an animal. The loss of anything important is what I tried to say and what I shared last week. And I went on to talk about the loss of a job, home. These are things that create grief in our life. Financial security, not having that, or trying to get that causes grief. Divorce, miscarriage, and even aging. Remember we talked about aging and how aging can create grief because we can't do what we used to do. And then the loss of our physical beauty. I know you're looking at someone that, as we go through life, we do get wrinkles and we do lose some of our beauty. And that's a grieving process also. The loss of a best friend, the relocation, even relocating, going from a home to, say, here. That is a time of grieving, a time that's tough on people. And then, of course, we talked about the loss of self-respect, losing our independence, even going as far as taking our driver's license away and not being able to have that anymore. That's a part of grief. And, of course, disability and illnesses. And then I shared with you last week the 5 stages. And this week, I'm going to define these stages, but here you need to understand this first of all. In these stages of grief that we go through, people spend different lengths of time working through one stage more than they do the other stage. In other words, one of the stages is anger. Somebody might go through the grieving process. They might be angered for 2 or 3 years. And I'm just exaggerating, but that can happen. And they go through the depression part. They may only be depressed for a week or so. But just to help you understand that everybody don't go through these stages exactly the way I'm going to share them, and they don't go through them all the same length of time. But they are a part of the grieving process. So what I'm trying to say is, in the grieving process, there are different levels of intensity. And y'all come on in, have a seat. And in these different levels of intensity on the grieving process, we understand that it takes someone a little bit longer to get through this aspect more than another. So, as we begin today, I want to share with you the 5 stages of grief, and I want to, today, I want to define those stages of grief. So, the first stage I want to share with you is denial and isolation. Denial and isolation. The first reaction to learning of a situation that causes grief. Sometimes it is anger. Sometimes it is denial and isolation. So the first one I want to talk to you about is denial and isolation. It is a normal reaction to rationalize overwhelming emotions. Y'all come on in, have a seat. Pardon me? The meeting's at 11:30. I'm doing the 11:11 right now on grieving. Okay? But you can come and listen if you want to. So as we go through the grieving process, the first, as I shared, is denial and isolation. This is when that we rationalize overwhelming emotions. In other words, something in our life that creates an emptiness, something that creates grief, something in our lives that creates a sadness. That is a stage of grief, and that's an understanding that we need to understand. I guess what I want to say is this isolation and denial is a defense mechanism that buffers the immediate shock of the grief. Please understand that. It buffers the immediate shock of the grief. And that's why sometimes this is the first thing that happens in the grieving process. And that is the denial and isolation. In other words, we block out words. We block out what people say to us. We hide from the facts of whatever it is that you're going through that created the grief in your life. And as I shared in the opening statement, and I shared last week, there's many, many forms of grief that create that. And if you're going through a divorce, that could create grief. Just moving from here to another place can create grief. Anything that's traumatic in your life, that changes in your life, can cause grief. So, in denial and isolation, this is a temporary response that carries us through the wave of pain. This denial and isolation. So just keep that in mind, because it is something that carries us through the initial shock and carries us through the initial pain. And then the second stage of grief, or the second stage of emptiness, is masking, is called anger. And you probably can understand this, because I know that I've seen many people, I've counseled many people as a pastor, as a chaplain, about the anger part. People get angry. They mask the effects of whatever it is that happened in their life to cause grief or cause the emptiness by denial, isolation, and it begins to wear on them. And then as it begins to wear on them, the pain reemerges in their life. And what happens when the pain reemerges in their life? They get angry. Anger starts. The intense emotion is deflected or by the anger that you have in your life. And the anger may be aimed at inanimate objects. It could be aimed at complete strangers. It could even be aimed at, and this is where it usually happens, and that is friends or family. You get angry at somebody in your family, you get angry at your friends, but anger is a part of grieving. It's a part of the emptiness part. Anger may be directed and I've seen this happen before, at a person in your life. It's very special in your life, but they're dying, or they have a terminal illness. And all of a sudden you get angry, and I know you're saying, I would never do this, but it happens. But you get angry at the person who is sick, the one who's dying. And I've seen that happen many, many times. So we need to understand that creates rationalizing. And when you rationalize, you know the person's not the blame, but you're pointing the blame at the person. But the person can't help they're sick, or can't help they're dying, or can't help the situation that they're in. So you become emotionally involved, and by becoming emotionally involved, you resent the person are the factor that's creating the pain in your life. And, of course, there you go. There's the anger. We start feeling guilty and we start feeling angry. And, of course, what does that do? That makes us angrier. And we get worse and we get worse and we get worse. And then we remember that the grieving is a personal process that has no time, no limit, and no one right way to grieve. We understand that. Matter of fact, we even go as far as when we're in the anger stage, we'll blame the doctor who diagnosed the situation. And by diagnosing the situation, we are a part of that grieving process. And being a part of that grieving process, that created a lot of problems. And we even go to the health professionals. We might blame it on a nurse. We might even blame it on someone that took care of your loved one or whatever happened. So as we go through the grieving process, we understand and we know that being a part of the grieving process, that we are not allowing ourselves to do nothing but get angry. And when we get angry at that grieving process, we start taking it out on a lot of people that are innocent bystanders. And how many times have you heard someone sitting around talking about, well, my loved one died because the doctor diagnosed them wrong. Or they could have done this or could have done that. When you do that, what you're doing in your life is you're making it all right that you're grieving, and you're making it all right because your loved one passed away, and you're throwing the blame on the doctor or the nurse or the healthcare worker. And that so often is a part of the anger stage. That's a part of allowing yourself to deal with the grief. So we have denial, we have isolation, and we have anger. And then the third part of grieving, the third stage of grieving, is bargaining. You start bargaining things in your mind. You start feeling a helplessness or feeling that emptiness in your life in a way that you need to feel, you need to regain control. And we start asking questions. We start asking ourselves, and this is what we do. We start saying, well, and I'm just giving you some examples, well, if only we had sought medical attention sooner, maybe they would have lived a little longer. Or we ask the question, if only we got a second opinion. See, you start bargaining with whatever's going on. That's part of the grieving process. And then we may ask the question, well, if only we had tried to do better ourselves or be a better person towards them. That's all a part of the grieving process. That's all a part of the bargaining process. And secretly, we may make a deal with God or a higher power in an attempt to postpone the inevitable. And that's coming to reality. So let me say this, and this is something that we understand in the grieving process, that this bargaining chip, I'd call it a chip or stage, is a weaker line of defense to protect us from a painful reality. That's the bottom line. And it's so important to understand that, because sooner or later, it may be 5 years down the road, it could be a month down the road, we come to reality with what's happening in our life. And we need to understand that, because reality is important when you get into the grieving process. And then the fourth stage of the grieving process is depression. Most of you know all about depression. But there's two types of depression that's associated with dealing with grief or emptiness. Number one, the first is having a reaction to practical implications relating to a loss or a situation. In other words, there's a sadness or there's a regret that dominates this type of depression. In other words, going through a situation that you did not want to go through, and you start worrying about everything. You start getting depressed because of the cost of maybe a funeral, a burial, or the cost of whatever the situation is. If you're going through a divorce, the cost of that divorce, or if you're even downsizing from your home into an apartment or into a retirement village, the downsizing, can I cope with that? How can I handle that? That's part of what we call the depression stage. That is the phase, it may be simply something that we have no reassurance about, and everything's a question in our mind. That's part of what we call depression. And we just need a bit of helpful cooperation with a few words. And a lot of times, and I'm going to talk about this next 11:11, is what are the right questions? How do we react to grief? How do we react to people who are grieving? And how do we go through that with ourselves? And then the second type of depression is a more subtle type of depression. In a sense, as a matter of fact, it's more private. And it's our quiet preparation to separate and to bid our loved one farewell. We kind of get depressed within ourselves, and we have that private type of depression on whatever it is, or the situation that we're going through that's creating the depression. And sometimes all we really need from people, and this is what I'm sharing that's very important, is maybe just a hug and a presence. Don't need to say nothing. Don't need to tell them what they're going through or what they need to go through or how they need to go through it. All they need is your quietness, and let them talk, and a good hand to hold or a hug. 9 times out of 10, that's all a person needs when they're going through grieving process and understanding. And this type of depression, when someone keeps it from within, it creates a lot of health problems. It creates a lot of other problems in their life. So we've talked about denial. We've talked about isolation, anger, bargaining, depression. And then the last stage is acceptance. I love this stage, don't you? Is that when we go through all this process, we begin to reach a stage of mourning in a way that's healthy, in a way that is good. We start accepting the situation, or whatever is the situation, whatever is the emptiness. And then all of a sudden, the emptiness starts slowly but surely going away because we're dealing with it. So death or situation may be sudden, it may be unexpected, or we may never see beyond our anger stage or denial. But it's not necessarily a mark of bravery to resist the inevitable and to deny ourselves the opportunity to make peace with ourselves. It's so important that we understand that. And this phase, this stage of acceptance, maybe happen by just withdrawing ourselves from the situation and really thinking about it and calming ourselves and being a part of that. This acceptance may not be a period of happiness, but a period of understanding. Because you may be going through a grieving process, and this is just a good example of someone who has terminal illness and they haven't passed away. And you get to the acceptance part of they're going to pass away. That's a part of understanding the grieving process and making and bargaining it and making the acceptance. So the acceptance part is when we withdraw ourselves from all the other stages, the denial, the isolation, the anger, the bargaining, and the depression, and allow ourselves to come to fruition, to come to an understanding that I'm not going to allow this to affect my life anymore, and I know that person or that loved one or the situation, I need to continue on and be the best that I can be. That's going through and understanding the 5 stages of grief. I want to thank you for being here today and being a part. Thank you for being here live and being a part. And next week, I'll be on vacation, but the next Friday, I'll be back on 11/11, and we're going to talk about the questions and answers of how do we handle people who are grieving and how do we handle ourselves. What do we do personally? So I hope you'll join us and be a part of that, and thank you for allowing me to take 20 minutes of your time. So I hope you all have a good weekend.